Hey everyone, we are back for our Week 6 NFL main slate review, joined with Max Steinberg here. As always, we look forward to doing this show for you guys each and every week. And this week, we are going to be doing something a little different than past weeks here. So if you guys missed the most recent app update that went live just this past Thursday, I believe, we are now loading in all of the lineups in Contest Flashback. So previously, for large contest sizes like over 100,000 entries, we were only loading the top 20,000 entries. Well, now we are loading the entire contest. So that gives us the ability to look at the large field milli makers and all of these other large field contests and see all of the lineups. So we're really excited about this show. Max, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm excited about this one because, the dream is to win $1 million when you're playing on DraftKings. So now we get to look at how we might be able to do that. So let's get into it.
Yeah. And just big shout out to our development and engineering team. I know they've been working really hard on getting this out the door here. So I think everyone is excited for this update. But
Yeah.
with that said, can get Severson pulled up here. We are going to look at 3 weeks of Millie Makers here. We're going to start with week 6, which is this current week here. And then we're going to look at week 4 and week 3 specifically here. So let's jump in to week 3. I have the lineups loaded up here, and we are going to start with looking at the highest sim ROI lineups. So let's sort by sim ROI. All right, so we have the lineups pulled up here. They are sorted by highest sim ROI here. And Max, tell me what you're seeing. I'm seeing one familiar face right out the gate with Giant Split up here. And so give me your thoughts.
Well, I would say the first thing I'm seeing is there's no Raheem Mostert in any of these lineups. And I think, would you mind looking at player exposures? I think he ended up being, 50% owned or something like that, or pretty high
54%
on.
owned.
Yes. And so and obviously he did very, very well. So there's that. But that is interesting because, we've talked about this in previous weeks, and sometimes it's hard to know how chalky is too chalky for a player. And, maybe Saberson was a little low on him compared to maybe other projection systems. I think the highest I saw was maybe 20 fantasy points. But it is interesting, it was a little hard to predict that he was really going to get that high ownership. But it does seem like in these millionaire makers that theoretically, at least, if you have someone who's just going to be like really, really chalky, and there are other running backs that project pretty well, it might make sense, especially in these top heavy tournaments, to fade that player. So that's what I see right off the bat. Anything that you see?
Some of the things that I'm noticing are just I seeing like these RAM stacks or like these mini correlations with like Tyreek Hill and Adam Thielen, Tyreek Hill and Shuba Hubbard, and then you're getting some of these like more just like QB+2 type lineups, but nothing like glaring at me saying like, oh wow, like this looks like different or out of the park, I'd say.
Well, the other thing is the ROIs are really high, right? I mean, this lineup had a theoretical 3,000% ROI. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons that these tournaments are so appealing is that if you hit the right buttons, you can theoretically make a lot of money on your lineups. And I'm wondering, the thing is the lineup that does have this very high ROI is pretty contrarian across the board. But all the players project pretty well. So I think on a slate where there's a lot of good plays, like this past one, if you can find the ones that are a good play, but they're just not good enough or there's not enough narrative where people are not going to steam them, that they can become really good plays. I mean, Brandon Powell, I think, is a perfect example. Stoneman projects pretty well, and he just doesn't. It's windy, it's not a good game script. He just doesn't have the narrative that's going to drive up his ownership. Same with Tyler Higbee, sort of like the third option that you'd stack on this team. And there's other tight ends that people want to play. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm surprised at some of these ownerships I'm seeing, man. Like DJ Moore, 25% ownership. That's crazy to me. I'm that just surprises me. But in general, I don't know. I'm not sure that I'm seeing anything here that, I mean, Kendrick Bourne was 3% owned. That also is crazy to me. I mean, I thought he projected very well. He ended up doing very well. It seemed like there was just some plays this week that people did not want to play for one reason or another. I mean, to me, this was a very good week for making a lot of profit if things went right. So I think some of these ownerships don't make a lot of sense, and it just goes to show that there's still money in DFS. So that's really sticking out to me.
I think that, something that we've seen, because like up to this point, right, we haven't had access to these large field, super top heavy contests. We've been looking at a lot of smaller stuff, right? In those previous contests, we're seeing, people getting different in 1 to 2 spots, people getting different in 2 to 3 spots, right? And here in these lineups, like the ownership, like you're saying, for these top sim ROI lineups is actually very kind of different than a lot of that smaller field stuff that we've looked at previously, right? I mean, if we look at Giant Squid's lineup, he has 2 players over 10% owned, everybody else below that. If we look at this top sim ROI lineup, they only have 3 players over 10% owned. And so
Right.
the super top heavy is just showing me that, hey, take more shots, get more contrarian, and hope that those plays work out. But these lineups are still well correlated, even though you're playing these much lower owned plays. We have the QB +2 in this top lineup, and then we have the mini correlation with Ramondre Stevenson in their defense. We have, or I'm sorry, we even had a bring back in this lineup with Marquise Brown as well. Giant Squid had the QB +2 for the Bucks with the mini correlation with Hubbard and Hill. So just low ownerships and still getting to those correlated pieces is what I'm seeing.
Yeah. Do you want to look at the actual ROI top lineup?
Of
Let's
course.
see the lineups that actually did well.
All right. So jumping over to our actual ROI highest winning lineups here. Congratulations to the winners. But Max, what are you seeing? Comparing these lineups to kind of the lineups that we just looked at with highest sim ROIs.
Yeah, so what jumps off right off the bat is all of these actually have negative sim ROIs. And so I think when you're looking at this, the question is part of ROI is going to be related to projection. And obviously it's going to be related a lot to upside, but that's related to projection as well, right? So for example, SaberSim has Desmond Ritter projected at 14.5 points, has Drake London projected pretty low, it has Kyle Pitts projected pretty low, and has Raheem Mostert projected pretty low compared to what he actually did, right? And so the question is then is, do we think that these lineups are negative ROI because we're wrong on these projections, or do we think they're negative sim ROI because there's something constructurally wrong with them? And I think it's probably a little bit of both. I think in terms of construction, right, playing a 55% owned running back and is just not going to be good in this contest. And the thing is you're not going to know that pre-contest, right? I thought Raheem Mostert was going to get 30% ownership, 35% ownership. He ended up getting 55. There's not really, it's a skill to try to figure out like how is this player going to get steamed, or if they're not, and sometimes you're not going to know that. But then there's the other thing is the rest of the construction is fine if you think Desmond Ritter is underprojected, and if you think Drake London is underprojected, and you think Kyle Pitts is underprojected. And that was possibly true, right? Washington secondary is really young, and it's been really, really bad. And, maybe we're too low on these players. Drake London obviously had an amazing game, and he theoretically, in theory, he got a lot of targets, right? And so if we see someone get a lot of targets, that sort of says, maybe we're a little bit wrong, as opposed to someone like Rashid Shaheed, who I think had 2 targets. They were just really long targets and 1 touchdown, right? And he ended up performing very, very well. So I think it's interesting here. I think it's possible if we projected Ritter differently, then maybe those ROIs would stand out. But I think the main thing here is, if you just have someone who's really chalk, Adam Thielen's another one, right? He ended up being really chalk because he's a bring back for Miami players or a bring back for Mostert. But he did not project that well. Obviously, he did very well. And that's another question of, was this bad chalk or should he have been projected higher? And even if he was projected higher, would that have been a good play? Probably not. So I think with Mostert and Thielen in general, I think what I am seeing here is, hey, these lineups did well because the chalk really, really hit in some forms. And those people that had that chalk did really well. And obviously some of the chalk did not hit, like DJ Moore. But if it does hit like that, your theoretical good lineups are going to become theoretically bad. But the good thing is that you go through that process. Chalk doesn't hit every week. There's many weeks where the chalk just completely fails. People get injured. Lots of different things happen. And so when that happens, it's going to pay off really big time if you keep making those theoretical good lineups.
Max, question: do you think that the field has gotten a lot better on figuring out who are just the best plays week in, week out, and maybe that I'd say like some of this ownership like might be more warranted in like 2023 than in like previous NFL seasons? Thoughts on that?
No, I mean absolutely not. I think people are spoiled. The chalk has hit a lot this season, and there's a lot of randomness, right? I mean, case in point, DJ Moore was 25% owned, and the field did terribly in that instance. I would say that was a unequivocally bad play. There's certainly opportunity. I mean, even Raheem Mostert, players can be good plays, and they can fail all the time. It's just in their range of outcomes, and you'll see it. We've had 6 slates this season. It's not a lot. Like imagine basketball, right? Where it's like you have a good week, you have a bad week. Sometimes it feels like everything goes wrong. Sometimes it feels like everything goes right. There's just not a lot of weeks here. And having that perspective, being results oriented and saying, well, we're just really good at picking players now. I just don't think that's true, because even if you are really good, the players are just still going to do badly sometime. And that's the beauty of DFS, is that there's a lot of game theory involved. And with that game theory, you can play the ranges of outcomes for different players and make really high ROI lineups. And yeah, I think that in this case, it's just like, Raheem Mostert, probably in hindsight, I would say was 20, 21 points projected. But 20, 21 points projected, I mean, you can look at it with these ranges of outcomes. That can be 9 points and that can be 30 points, right? And so I just think it's just absurd to think, hey, we're just really good at predicting this. If you look at historically, looking at accuracy of projection systems, it's not that high. The R squareds are not that high, especially for wide receivers, especially for quarterbacks, and even running backs. It's higher, but it's not that much higher. And the idea that somehow we're just getting so much better at this, I think it's crazy to me.
That's great. And I thought you made a really good point. Looking at an NFL regular season, there are 18 main slates, right? If you look at MLB, you look at NBA, you're playing 30 days a month and you're doing that for 6 months, which is 180 days. So an MLB season, an NBA season is 10 times as big, 10 times as many main slates as NFL season. So, at the end of the day, this is not a lot of slates. So I think that's a really good point to drive home, just for users that maybe haven't seen the results that they wanted yet. It's still so early, and then even by the end of the season, not the biggest sample size there.
Yeah. I mean, I love it personally. I think people are going to have that perspective that you have, where they go, up, I just can't fade the chalk. It's too good of a play. And the reality is all these guys, no matter how good they are, I mean, look at Christian McCaffrey, right? Christian McCaffrey straight up got injured during the game, right? Like he was certainly higher projected than Raheem Mostert. even in hindsight, right? He's amazing,
Right.
but he had 13 fantasy points. It was in his range of outcomes. It's just there's so many different things that can happen.
True.
I don't believe that we're just so good at predicting these things now.
Well, glad to hear your thoughts on the topic. I'm sure that's reassuring to a lot of people. Well, do you want to hop over to our maxers now? All right, so we're going to jump into looking at our top 150 maxers. So we are basically filtering for 150 maxers under entries and then sorting by sim ROI, and MB Habes was our top 150 maxer as far as sim ROI is concerned.
Yeah, I think this is also a Saber Sim user as well, so I'm not surprised.
Let's
So
jump
let's
over to
look
stack
at
exposure.
well, why don't we look at QB exposure too first? Because it seems like
Okay.
yeah. Oh, so interesting. So this is interesting. So lots of contrarian QB plays, right? We have Sam Howell at 2% ownership, Jimmy Garoppolo 2%, Derek Carr 1%, CJ Stroud at 1.5%, Baker Mayfield at 4%. There's some chalk QBs. It seems like he didn't really like completely fade the chalk. He just seemed
Right, just like
like
matched.
this is like half his portfolio is kind of these contrarian QB plays. So I think that's pretty interesting. Can we look at his overall player exposure? Because I did see that there is a lot of Raheem Mostert in there, if I'm
Yeah,
not
and
mistaken.
just one thing
Yeah.
on this topic. This is like a question that comes in during office hours or shows, and basically people are like, hey, I don't know what to do like with the chalk. It's like sometimes the best thing you can do is just match them, have about as many shares as the field does and take shots elsewhere, right? So it seems like that's what happened here. Like, hey, I'm just going to match like the two of the most chalky QBs, but I'm going to take a bunch of shots on all of these other guys that I think have a good chance of getting there, right? So matching ownership is basically the most neutral thing you can do to one individual player. So I just wanted to mention that,
Yeah.
and then hop over to players.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's interesting here is, and it's making me rethink a little bit about this because when we're looking at the top actual ROI lineups, right? If you're going to get like a lineup that has straight up 3,000% ROI or 2,000% ROI, you're going to have to fade the chalk, right? You're going to have to figure different ways to fade the chalk and fade Raheem Mostert. But it seems like it's also possible, hey, as we've seen in previous slates, you can play chalk as long as you're making sure that you're getting these contrarian stacks. And once again, we're just seeing that, hey, you get a contrarian stack, that's going to be the most important thing for the ROI of your lineup. And you can see here that there's just a lot of contrarian stacks. And, Sam Howell, Terry McLaurin, that's just like huge leverage, like 1 to 3% ownership on both. Devontae Adams and Jimmy Garoppolo. Devontae Adams was 5% owned. Jimmy Garoppolo is very low owned. He basically is just taking this strategy where it's like, hey, I'm not going to worry too much about being too contrarian, except with my stacks. And that is causing his lineups to just have a huge ROI for them overall. So I think that's really interesting.
Right. Would definitely agree on the low owned correlated stack angle here. It's something that we've seen work and continues to work here. So I like it. All right. So moving on to week 4 now, we're going to review our week 4 Millie Maker lineups here. So sorted by sim ROI here, and going to talk about these lineups, try and compare them across weeks here and see what we see. So Max, I'll let you take it away.
Well, I think it's interesting. Again, we again see really high ROIs for some of these players in the 3,000%, and which goes to show, you can have really, really profitable lineups if you hit the right button. So that's really promising. And something I'm seeing here, it's a lot of these stacks that we're talking about, a lot of kind of contrarian under 7% owned type of stacks. We see CJ Stroud, Matt Stafford, Josh Allen. Let's see, Matt Stafford, Kenny Pickett, Brock Purdy. I don't remember exactly what the chalk was this week. I assume Tua probably was one of them. but it does seem like, oh, I see. This was the Chargers week. The Chargers and I assume Tua as well, but I think mostly Chargers. And Herbert was, and
Herbert
this is the
Wilson,
Aiden
Aiden
O'Connell.
O'Connell.
Yeah,
Right, right.
yeah. So it does seem like getting contrarian through the QB is very helpful. Interestingly enough, we see that Keenan Allen was actually in the top theoretical ROI lineup. And so that does go back to that point I was making before, that part of the reason something is good chalk or bad chalk really has to do with projection, right? If the projection is really high and they're chalky, then I think that can make them okay. If it's really high and it's a lot of narrative driven stuff or stuff that you think might be mistaken, then that can make it a much better fade. So I think that's interesting as well. But again, we do see a lot of these lineups have a lot of players with small ownership, 3% ownership, 2% ownership, all over the place. So it does go to show that, if you're playing these contests and you really want to have a high ROI lineup, it's going to take some, not just fading of the chalk, but fading of the chalk to these like really low owned guys that are viable, right? Fading Keenan Allen to get, someone who's 22% owned, or fading Raheem Mostert to get the next highest running back in week 6. That's not going to be as important as fading Keenan Allen to get like Nico Collins, or fading Keenan Allen to get Steph Diggs, who's 12% owned. Doing things like that, or George Pickens, right? That's going to be a lot more helpful than just like fading this guy for, someone who actually doesn't project as well, who's going to get high ownership too. So I think that is something that is definitely important to look at.
I'd say that, the looking at week 6, looking at week 4 now, the risk profiles of these highest sim ROI lineups just seem very, very high. And I would feel like, coming into a Millie Maker and trying to build a lineup that can win this contest, like you got to be comfortable with bricking like very often, because don't think, you might not hit very often, but when you do hit, you're going to have this lineup that can take you all the way to the top, which is ultimately what you want, right? The pay differential from first to second is massive. I mean, I think the payout is $1 million to first and 125K to second, which is just this huge jump, right? And it gets like so high variance up there at the top. So the risk profiles make a lot of sense to me for these lineups. And this is like probably, if I were going to mix this lineup into my contest selection, it'd probably be like one of the last contests that I decide like, hey, to put this apart of. I think there's so many good other good contests, under $3 or with good payout structures, where I would, recommend putting your bankroll allocation first before playing these type of contests. So just wanted to make that note. By no means are we reviewing these saying, hey, you got to go play the Millie, next week. We're giving you the secret sauce. So I just wanted to mention that.
No, that's a good point. I think something else I'm noticing is sort of like bad projection or bad value with the middling ownership is kind of the worst thing you can do. Because if you look at some of these lineups, right, we have Jerry Jeudy is in one of these lineups, and he is almost certainly bad value. T. Higgins is also bad value. But because of their ownership numbers, and because of the upside that both those players have, they end up being actually decent lineups for the millionaire maker. Or, someone like Allen Robinson, again, is not that great value, but he has like fractional ownership. Jawan Johnson is not that great value, but he has fractional ownership. So basically, if you can find these guys who are really going to get like under 5% ownership and do have that upside, our contest simulator is basically saying like, hey, these are actually pretty good, right? I don't see anything like that for someone who has like 15% ownership that doesn't project well. I don't really see that at all. right?
True.
So it's interesting there where it's like, hey, you know, and I guess we've really been saying this every week, but it's sort of like, hey, find a stack that has good upside that like doesn't have that good value, but you know, is gonna get pretty low ownership because if you do that, it can end up being really, really just a really, really good play. So that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? When you look at the ownership, like, hey, this play might not be great projection wise, might not be great value here, but if it hits, your lineup is going to be so different from the other lineups that it's really going to boost you and your ROI. But if this play is 10 to 15% owned, then there's still so many other lineups you have to beat. You're basically almost wasting your kind of one-off kind of outcome on a stack or group of players that aren't going to get you all the way there, right? So like that's kind of another way that I think about it, going off building off what you're saying.
Yeah. You want to look at actuals?
Sure. All right, so we're going to jump in here and look at the highest actual ROI lineups here. And Max, I'll let you take it away.
You know, it's interesting. I am not. I mean, obviously, what jumps out is Christian McCaffrey had a really good game and Josh Allen had a really good game. And Nico Collins had a really good game. Indeed. So there was basically like three stacks that had really good games. And it's interesting because in these cases, again, their ROIs are not popping out. And so the question is did SaberSim get any projection wrong here? Or why are their ROIs not popping out? And I guess one thing is the top lineup is Michael Wilson, who just straight up, I mean, is fractional ownership, but we projected at just horrible value and not good upside. And he actually did have some upside, so it's possible that there's something we got a little wrong there, and I think he projected up the next week, so there's something there. And Christian McCaffrey was high owned and did not project that well and had high price, and so this is one of the things where this was probably in his range of outcomes despite his projection, and I don't know if there's anything wrong there. He just, as we're talking about in week 6, right? He like, and I know it's against the Browns, but hey, yeah, like, you know, there's ranges of outcomes here, right? But yeah, I mean, it's basically like these stacks SaberSim didn't like, and you know, and there's a lineup with Devon Achan, who this was the week before he broke out. I'm pretty sure. So there's just a lot of different things where a lot of people hit that were kind of chalky, that SaberSim didn't project well, and that ended up sort of, you know, making these lineups do really well, even though they theoretically were not as good. I do notice that the third lineup actually had a really good theoretical ROI, so that's interesting.
Right.
Yeah. So and you know, that sort of follows the formula that we've been talking about, where you have a double stack where there's a lot of leverage here, where we have a 6% on DJ Moore and 3% on Cole Kmet. But you know, this is why I don't love looking at actuals, because it's hard to sort of, you know, gather anything from it, honestly, other than, hey, this is what happened and what is there to say, right? We kind of sort of play this game in theory and hope that the actual works out. So
Yeah, I'd say this third lineup is like
yeah.
probably the most interesting here, right? High positive sim ROI here follows or like looks very similar to a lot of the things that we've discussed in work in theory, right? And then this lineup kind of gets there, right? So a lot of people are like, hey, my lineup's grading out great in the contest sim, right? But they might not be having great actual ROI. It's like, well, we're playing out the contest sim 100,000 times to try and figure out how this lineup does. We play the slate over and over and over, but at the end of the day, the slate only gets played one time, and that is just so high variance about which way that can go. And so I think that this third lineup makes a lot of sense here with the low owned QB +2, with the run back stack, and all of those players like in the 5 to 6K range. They pay up for the great projection for Christian McCaffrey and get to some of these more like one-off kind of chalk pieces, but their core stack is well correlated. It's low owned, and so that is if I had to root for one of these lineups, that would be the lineup. Or if I had to pick one, to play before the slate, I would try and take something more along those lines. And I would have came in third, but that's okay.
Yeah, and also I guess we're not even rating this line any of these lineups that bad. I mean, it's interesting. I think that with some of these players, if their projections were different, we might have rated them higher. And none of the lineups seem bad to me. Nothing is like striking me as bad. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not really sure what to think. I don't know. I'm not sure.
All right, so we're going to move on to week 3 here. Look at the highest sim ROI lineups here. So Max, I will let you take it away.
Well, I think this is good to see. We're seeing consistency here, right? It's once again getting that contrarian, getting that low end stack. It really helps. It really, really helps. And those are going to be the highest ROI lineups. So I think if there's like a general takeaway from this, that's what you're looking for, right? Is you're looking to pivot off the chalk, but not pivot off the chalk to that third or second best play that doesn't project that well, and there's a reason that it's the second best play, but that play that it projects pretty well, and people are just not going to gravitate towards it for some reason. So you're going to get a good head start on what that might be by just looking at our ownership projections. But it's going to take some thinking from you, right? Is you have to look at, hey, what are the narratives here? What do you see people touting? What has a high game total? What player is being unnecessarily kind of dumped on? And if you can find those, it can work out really, really well. And you can see also like the fourth lineup, this sort of reinforces my point. The fourth highest ROI lineup is actually, or fifth, I'm sorry, is Kirk Cousins. And it just goes to show, right? Kirk Cousins was by far the chalkiest QB. And this idea of just like fade the chalk is not really right. It's fade the chalk for something that is really going to be like a low owned good stack, or you can just go with the chalk, stack it up like this person is doing, where they're going Madison, Osborne, TJ Hawkinson, and then if you do that, it can still be a really, really good lineup.
Right. I think kind of a point you made earlier, and I think you just kind of reiterate right now. It's like, hey, we're not saying fade the highest owned player and then play the next two. Like it's like if you're gonna fade, that stack with that chalky QB, like you almost need a different stack that is very low owned, and when it does well, it's going to take you to the top of your contest. So it's not going from 25% owned Kirk Cousins to a 15% owned quarterback, a 16, 17, like in that range there. Like the quarterbacks that are showing up here as highest MROI are 2%, 3%, 4%, right? Like very, very different. Probably like much lower here on the quarterback ownership rankings than 1 through 5 are.
Yeah. I think another thing, I think you made this mistake, but we're actually sorting by win rate. But I really like that because, or we might not be, are we not?
I don't think we are. I think this is a bug right now where it's not showing right, but all of these are the highest sim ROI lineups.
Okay. So I think what's interesting is, what is driving the high ROIs for this contest is win rate, basically. if this lineup wins the contest, you're going to win $1 million. That's a huge ROI. And so something that you might be seeing over looking at these reviews is a lot of these high sim ROI lineups that we're looking at end up being zeros, like they have a negative actual ROI. And that's just something to keep in mind, right? Is when you're playing a tournament like this, and this is why sort of we have some recommendations like, hey, you need to balance how you're playing contests, right? Is these contests, they're really high ROI, they're really high variance, right? And so you can't just bank on making money even during an NFL season on just these like high first place big field contests like the Millionaire Maker. But when it does go right and you're having this contrarian stack and everything goes right, you're actually going to hit and hit really big. Whereas the reason that some of these lineups that are more chalky that aren't doing things right is when they go right, a lot of people have the same type of lineup as you, and you end up not winning as much as when you have these contrarian pieces. And so that's just something to keep in mind is like, hey, just because the lineup didn't win didn't mean it's not a good lineup. And this is going to happen a lot. And when it does work, you're just maximizing your chance of actually getting first or getting in the top 10. And that's why these lineups are so good.
Yeah, and I think like a grounding kind of metric here is cash rate, right? Cash rate for these top sim ROI lineups, 32%, 34%, 34%. Like think about baseball, right? I mean, where a good hitter gets a hit 3 out of 10 times, still misses 7 out of 10. Even these lineups, the highest sim ROI lineups, still cashing, around that 3 out of 10 mark. So very, very, still like unlikely that you even cash, even with these lineups that are high sim ROI. But when you do cash, you're gonna hit the grand slam. You're gonna hit like or that's what you're like. We're trying to build the lineups for. Like, hey, when we do get our hit, our lineup has the potential to hit the grand slam, right? So that's like an analogy that I would think of when reviewing results and looking at these lineups.
Yeah, that's a perfect point. Is when we're building for the Millionaire Maker, we're like that Joey Gallo type hitter. We want to just hit a home run or strike out, right?
Right. I think
When
that's
we're
great.
playing cash games, we want to be like Ichiro. We just want to hit singles. We want to get on base. It's a perfect analogy. So it's not surprising to see that some of these highest theoretical ROI lineups are failing actually quite a bit. Because hey, we're looking at win rates that are like 0.04%, right? That's really low. That's like worse than the chance of you getting the worst beat you've ever had in poker. And right, like and so it's just we're playing with small percentages. And the beauty of that is that you can have theoretically huge ROIs. It's just going to take a while to realize those ROIs. So it's just a good lesson for, hey, if you're playing these lineups, like view it as a gamble that, you're trying to hit big, but it can't be like your way of making money or your sole use of your entire bankroll, unless you're just, gambling, which we don't like to do. So,
Right.
yeah.
Um, Max, don't know how much we're going to get out of looking at the actual ROIs, or do you want to wrap?
Yeah, let's wrap it up.
All right. Well, hey, everybody. Hope you guys really enjoyed this week's breakdown, getting to look at a couple of Millie Maker weeks here. Again, big shout out to the team for getting this up in the app. Going to continue to improve this product, but feel like it's going in a great direction. This should help with your guys's research using contest flashback for all large field contests, right? I know a lot of you guys are playing the mini max, participating in our max challenge. This should help a ton with that. So really this show is to help you guys, think about DFS, what to look for. It's almost a week in, week out tutorial of the contest flashback tool. So take these ideas, concept, things that we're talking about, look at your own contest that you're playing. And we hope to, provide a lot of value for you guys each and every week. Max, final thoughts?
Yeah, just to sum up what I had been saying, it seems like something that I'm learning here is, as we said in prior videos, but this is just emphasizing this, is winning GPPs. The real key is getting that low on stack and hopefully a bigger stack, right? Something that's a QB plus 2 or QB plus 3. That's going to really help you get the leverage that you need in order to win one of these tournaments. And it is really the best way to sort of pivot off the chalk. You know, these second highest owned, third highest owned QBs, if they're not that great value or they're not enough of a value improvement, then they're going to end up being a bad play. So look to do that when you're building lineups for these GPPs, and you're gonna probably end up on one of these leaderboards with the highest sim ROI. So hopefully that translates into actual ROI.
Yep, 100%. Couldn't have said it better myself. But all right, everybody, we'll be right back next week, week 7, for our next review. Until then, good luck in all of your contests. We will see you guys. Thanks. Bye.